ladies and gentle sirs, or whoever is joining us today. Thank you for being here. Welcome back. We are continuing on our journey with the 2024 Elevate and Illuminate Organizational Excellence Series, Bloom Masterclass Series. Today, we are moving forward into kind of talking about conflict and confrontation. So today we're talking about being the emotional intelligent mediator, crafting peace in conflict with emotional acumen. So I am Dr. Claire Muselman. If you have no idea who I am, well, welcome. I'm a behavioral scientist at Drake University and spent a fair amount of time in the workers' compensation system and still here operating as the Chief Operating Officer, workerscompensation.com. And then I am president of my own company, DCM. But let's get to what we are doing today. So really excited that you are here with us today, especially that Bloom is having this series because there's so much emotional intelligence that we need, and that this is a skill set that we've been talking about all year, but really it's one that can be developed over time. Emotional intelligence ends up being very similar to like going to the gym to train a muscle. If you are willing and able to learn, you can absolutely grow and enhance your skill set. So today we're going to focus a little bit more on conflict and confrontation. And we're going to talk about how it impacts us individually, because the best way to understand what's going on in somebody else is to first understand it within ourselves. So we're going to take a little deep dive into ourselves first, and then understand the science behind what actually goes on when we are engaging in a conflict. Because guess what? Your brain is triggering responses, and you might not be aware of exactly what's going on in your head, but your body's releasing hormones, and you can feel sometimes when a conflict is arising. And so, like, when we explore what impacts our daily lives, conflict is involved there. It's decision making. There's a lot of things that can go into this, and there's the right way, or maybe not the way that you would consider it, but as long as it gets the job done, we move forward and life is good. So whether you're in the workplace or you are in your personal life, maybe you're dealing as a parent or maybe in an interpersonal relationship, conflicts are unavoidable. And we know that this is true. So what if there was a tool that could help us navigate conflict in a way that creates more peace? And this is where we start to look at emotional intelligence. It helps keep chaos at bay, and it helps us with a little bit of this thing called emotional acumen, which we're going to discover today. So just to remind everybody where we are at right now, when we look at how do we define emotional intelligence, we are using the definition that we've used this series, which is the ability to recognize, understand, and manage our own emotions as well as the emotions of other people. And when we combine emotional intelligence and we start to use it with mediation techniques, this is where we can become masters at crafting peace in conflict situations. And I like to look at this from a twofold lens. There's conflict and there's confrontation. Confrontation ends up to be really heightened, and we end up hurting people's feelings in it, and we start to attack the person, where conflict is more constructive in its nature, and it is more about trying to drive innovation and moving the ball forward. Now, this is just my personal interpretation of this, and it can be different for you. But we're going to focus on emotional acumen and being able to understand your emotional intelligence with precision so that you can resolve conflicts effectively, because our goal is to keep things moving forward. Our goal today is to give you some tools to take home, reflect on, and apply in your personal lives and professional lives. So let's dive in a little bit deeper on this emotional intelligence. So we've got emotional intelligence. We're kind of talking about this. We've got the ability to recognize and understand where we're at. But a lot of this starts with our own self-awareness. And when we figure out where conflict arises, a lot of times we don't understand why we get upset about certain things. Now, we might think, well, somebody is attacking us as a person, but what's the why behind that? Why do we get upset or unhappy? And we'll talk through this in just a second. We also want to be empathic when we are utilizing conflict, or we are structured in conflict, because when we are able to put ourselves into other people's shoes, it helps us better understand where that other person is coming from. Now, it's not just that, but you don't have to agree with people when you're understanding the lens at which they are approaching things. We each come to the table with our own personal perceptive features, AKA bias, but I like the term personal perceptive features because it's less offensive these days. And also, we all have them. We all come to the table with a different lens to approach whatever we are dealing with. And so we start to look at things from that landscape. It can be really helpful to be more empathic, where, okay, I might not have ever experienced something like this, or I might not have seen a situation in this capacity, but I get where you're coming from. Again, you don't have to agree. You just need to be able to understand where they're coming from. And by doing this and being able to pull yourself out to a more 20,000-foot view, it's really helpful to build relationships because you're starting to foster some trust and understanding and belonging by working on your communication skills, which is a really big piece of this. So I want to dive into emotional acumen a little bit more. So we've got emotional intelligence and we put our of self-awareness as a superpower in there. And also, when we start to look at it from an emotional acumen standpoint, this is how you figure out what your own emotions are, what your triggers are, and how they influence your behavior. And we'll start to talk about what our triggers are and how they relate to us when we start to get navigating conflict. You also want to make sure that we're practicing empathy. That is also on the emotional acumen spectrum because, again, it's not just about understanding where somebody else is coming from. We can tend to be very direct on certain elements where we could be more kind, graceful, and compassionate to other people versus ourselves. But our ability to understand people is only to the depth that we understand ourselves. So it ends up being kind of a double-edged sword of how we practice empathy, but also understanding the emotional intelligence behind it. We also want to be present and attentive. Oh my goodness, dear God, when you guys are in conflict, please keep this little thing out of the view when you are navigating conflict. We need to be fully present and very attentive using active listening because we've got to be focused on what is not being said. And I'll talk through this in a few minutes. And also trying to suspend judgment. Again, just because it might not be true to you or you might not have experienced it doesn't mean that somebody else might not be in that same realm. And then we also have to figure out it is you're responsible for the energy you bring into the room, and your emotional regulation is also your responsibility. How do you diffuse things? If we look at resilience, resilience is your ability to bounce back from things. So if someone says something and it ends up making you feel offended, how quickly can you regulate yourself to bounce back and get right back in the game? We tend to think that other people have some type of control or agency over how we feel about things or about what's being said, where when we start to look at conflict and the why behind it, a lot of times it's our own stuff that we just have to own, regulate, and then deal with. So when we look at emotional regulation, you're also responsible for your attitude. You're responsible for the energy you bring into a room, and you're responsible for the attitude you're choosing to take. Now, some people take things more personally than others, and we will get into that here in a second. But as we start to explore emotional intelligence around this, we've got these different elements that we're paying attention to today, specific for conflict. This emotional regulation ends up being really, really important because I want you to be able to understand how to diffuse yourself because conflict can absolutely trigger physiological impacts to your body. Your body will feel and respond, whether it be from an energetic, I'm going to close myself off so I feel more protected, or continue to come into this fight, flight, freeze. Some people are going to call this fawning or appeasing. So there's different elements that come into this and how we choose to understand ourselves. So you've got your self-awareness element. We offer ourselves empathy, and then we figure out how to regulate our emotions as a result. It helps us be better at our own conflict resolution because we can understand what is going on with us in an interpersonal landscape to then better understand what's going on within our teams and other people. So if we remember, EQ has 5 elements. We've got self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. The areas that we want to focus on when we're looking at conflict management and emotional acumen really focus on self-awareness again, empathy, but now we're going to go more into emotional regulation, which you could consider self-regulation, and then our conflict resolution, which I would consider your social skills. So let's look at this. We tend to go into conflict when someone violates a value of ours. So if you start to think about what are your values, because your values are how you make decisions on a regular basis. We filter through our values on a regular basis. So if you think about some of those values that might be important to you, we are constantly filtering through this. And this is no different than in an organization as well. We've got organizations that have mission statements and vision statements and value statements. So we start to look at how our commitments that are held to our lives and our career paths and are the roles that we play, those end up shaping our responses and behaviors, the way people act as a result. And when we feel triggered by something and we feel offended and we start to feel a conflict arise, we've got to figure out, okay, what is triggering this in me? What value can I tie it to better understand? And I'm going to give you a very, very, very basic example today. So this morning I drove to downtown Des Moines, which Iowa you don't think of as traffic, but we have a interstate area that's closed and it's causing people to not drive in a way that I would prefer them to drive. I'm going to take I statements here. So I get frustrated and stressed out and I don't like it. And then I pass judgment on other drivers. Maybe some of you have these experiences in your own life. I'm just going to smile at that. With that, so when I think about like, what is that violating? Like, what does that trigger in me? And what I've realized is that it tends to trigger a devaluation of time. I feel like I have like time is super important to me, the time value of money. Don't waste my time. I say this to students, I say this to people I work with. Like, if we are going to exchange energy, I want it to be valuable and I want it to have mutual respect. So when I look to this and I think rush hour, or I think of poor drivers or anything there, that's a trigger for me. And when I think about why I'm triggered because it's a time issue. Now, could I leave earlier? Sure, but that's still going to be a time thing for me. So I'm paying attention to this. But when I look at what it comes to from a lens of value, like when this triggers me, what value do I think it's going against? So I would like to say, well, I think it's time. Okay, well, time isn't necessarily a value of mine, but respect or integrity kind of go hand in hand with that. So when I have people that I consider not driving like I would drive or, moving accordingly or whatever you want to call it, I feel that they are devaluing time and an element that I would consider it important. And that then makes me feel disrespected in the process. So, right, wrong, or indifferent, we've got to figure out what these things are. One of the other things, another example I will give you is I am a professor, and so we issue a syllabus at the beginning of each semester. I get really frustrated with people who will not reference the syllabus before reaching out to ask questions when they could easily find the answers on their own. I'm a big believer that we should be empowering people to be able to go find information on their own, seek information, and then give guidance along that way. So when I break this value down and I think, okay, that's something else that triggers me when someone will email me and it's like, it's in the syllabus. Why are you not reading that first? That should always be your first to go to. So when I think about that, one, it becomes time again. Two, it kind of goes into the respect thing. But for me, it's an independence violation. Like, my goal is to empower people to be independent, self-sufficient, sustaining people that can go figure this stuff out on their own and seek information to understand, which I would couple with freedom. And freedom is a big value or a lens that I like to look at things through. Like, why would you want to be codependent on somebody else's answer? Like, use your own agency of control. And so when we start to figure out like those little things that make you tick, and we want to dig into the why, there's usually a why there. You just have to get clear on it and then figure out how it ties to a value that you have. And we're not going to do values work today, but I think it's really important when we look at this from an organizational structure and we think about the personal perceptive features we bring into an organization, as well as what your organization values. So if we think about sometimes when we're dealing with conflict and people will violate a code of conduct or a code of ethics, those are set forth by our organizations. So when you violate that, people will be offended because it's a code or a commitment to the values that we've all agreed upon to be a part of this organization. And so when we start to figure out like what is it that violates that and what makes us feel triggered, this can be really helpful into understanding how we flip the script and how we start to articulate or explain ourselves in a way that someone else might understand. So when we start to look at connecting our triggers to our values, you've got to know what your values are. Now, organizations have those pretty structured out. Most of them do these days. But then when we look at how our own fundamental beliefs and principles that guide our decisions and actions, these have been around for a really long time. So I'm not going to say that we're born with them. I think it's a little nature nurture, but we refine them over time. Independence or freedom has always been one of mine since like very, very, very little, since I was tiny. And when I start to look at it, it's just gotten more fine tuned as I've aged. Same thing with like the respect or integrity piece. Loyalty is another one that's really big for me. Family is also one that when we start to look at what are these core values, like what are the, I will move everything out of the way to make sure these things exist, or like I'm moving things forward through these lenses. One of the ways that you can start to do to identify your values, and again, this isn't a values workshop, but just something if you're like, okay, I think I know what my values are, take a look at your calendar. Your calendar is going to be a really big depiction on where you place your value. So, are you spending time with your people in one-on-ones? Um, what are you doing for yourself? What does your self-development look like? What about your health and wellness? Do you prioritize that? When you start to look at where do you spend your time, another one is your bank account. Where are you spending your money? There's a lot of cool resources out there that can help you figure this out. And then also, when you start to identify your own values, asking an outside person, does this seem right? It's interesting with how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us along the way. But once we're able to figure out, okay, what are your core values? And this is where we can pinpoint our specific situations that trigger these emotional reactions in you. So a lot of times these come back to like an integrity respect issue where we are going to feel like somebody has crossed a boundary. And this is where we've got to self-reflect first. All right, is it a boundary that is important to me? Have I communicated it? A lot of this goes back to communication too, of what are our expectations? What are our accountabilities that we're putting in place? And then whose responsibility is it to uphold your boundaries? This is where we look at agency of control. So then we want to figure out what this connection is. And then we want to figure out our own self-awareness. And when we look at our emotional responses, and I'll cover this in a little bit with some brain activity, this is how it shapes our behaviors. So what can you do in that process? What are ways that once you get hijacked or we go into that fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or appease, and we start to think about what do we do to snap ourselves back out of this? So I want you to think about this. And if you are willing and able, please feel free to throw a value of yours in the chat. What are those core beliefs and principles that can guide your actions and decisions? Or maybe you want to look at what your organization stands for. Ideally, you've got a couple that might align with your organization, but think about that. What roles do those play in shaping your emotional responses? These end up being pretty important. Yes, Tamara. Oh, honesty and truth. I totally get that. Yes, honesty is a big one. When we start to look at that values and the triggers, this is where we start to figure out how we can manage our emotions more efficiently and effectively. Ethics and respect. Love that, Felicia. Thank you. All right. So your homework after today's class, or if you want to do this, I really want you to try and find 3 to 5 things that are your core values. And there are so many out there. Like you can Google this. I mean, we look at, I think most sheets that when we're trying to do any of these values exercises have like 80. So you can find whatever that is for you. And then also, it's not just about identifying the word, but how do you define it? And what does that look like for you? So think about that. And then we figure out, think about the most recent conflict that you might have had. Can you actually tie it back to one of those triggers that you might feel and how that would have violated a value of yours? So the more that we can get this and the more that we can dive into what is that? Okay. So I get really frustrated with drivers. And I was thinking about this today. I don't think this is ever going to go away. But I understand that it's because I feel that my time is being devalued and that is a respect piece for me. So, I'm not going to be able to change traffic, but this is one of the reasons I live in Iowa and not in downtown Chicago. So, things to think about from that. Or maybe there are ways that I can be more effective with my time when I'm in a vehicle. Apparently, dancing and singing has not been working lately. So let's look at another personal example. Let's say, all right, we're just gonna use family because here come the holidays. We are right on the tail of holidays. So let's think about during a recent family dinner, there was a discussion about how to handle a family heirloom, and it led to a heated debate. Okay, if you have ever had someone pass away, this tends to be a point of contention with who gets what, especially if it hasn't been outlined in the will, or even if it has been outlined in the will, families can get a little hasty with some of these things. So we're going to have different viewpoints. So I'm going to say my parents wanted to sell the heirlooms for financial reasons because maybe they needed it at this point. But my siblings and I felt it had sentimental value and we should keep it in our lineage and we should pass it down. Well, then we had a discussion on our priorities within our family. What happens? We end up reaching a compromise after some difficult conversations and acknowledging other people's viewpoints and perspectives. We find some middle ground with the heirloom's significance, respecting it, but also figuring out another way to address our family's practical needs. When we start to look at the compromising piece, there's a few different ways that we can do this, and this we're not going to talk about that in depth today. But when we're looking at the art of negotiation, it isn't always a 50-50 compromise. And I want to really highlight that because sometimes you're not going to be able to have that kind of leverage. If you think about this, when we look at how people negotiate hostage situations, let's say there's 20 hostages. Well, when we have hostage negotiators, they wouldn't want to split the difference and only bring back 10 people. Like it's 10 bodies, it's 10 humans, it's 10 lives. They want all 20. So they've got to figure out different leverage points. And so when we start to look at compromise and negotiation, we've got to get really clear on other areas that you can be negotiating so that it isn't a split the difference, because there are times where you have to get all of it, but what else can you deal with? Or what else is there? We've got to be innovative and think differently. So when we start to look at understanding our own self-awareness and this emotional intelligence part of this, this is where we start to figure out, what are your triggers? What are things that are going to set you off? Let me give an easy one for any of the ladies in the room. I love it when people want to tell me that I'm being emotional. Yes, stop being so emotional. Okay, I'm going to respectfully respond with, I'm very passionate about what I do, or I don't do it at all. I'm like, just not here to not have passion and energy towards things that I genuinely care about. So sometimes words can trigger things. And then there's a difference when you start to understand that these are things that are going to trigger you. I can tell you that if I ever get called emotional in a meeting, I uncross my legs, I recross my legs, I sit forward and I put my arms on the table and I say, may I offer an alternative perspective? I feel that my passion towards whatever we are dealing with makes me more apt to understand. And then I go into like the actual objectives behind it. I physiologically change myself. So again, uncross, recross. I physically move myself forward. I usually roll my shoulders back and down because that makes my energy center bigger, and your girl comes to play. So fight, flight, freeze. I tend to go to fight mode quite a bit. Not everyone is going to do this. Some of us will shut down. And even if you're going to shut down during something like that, I still want you to physiologically rearrange yourself. So uncross your legs, recross your legs, and then seat yourself forward. I say put your hands on the table because that is a sign of power and control, and we are controlling ourselves. We are the best agency for our control. Something else you can do if you're not in the mood to do that, you can always press between your thumb and your index finger, and it will start to change your brain. And we're going to talk about this just in just a second, about how do you get your brain rewired to stay in the game when you don't have time to just debrief, get up, go take a breath, and go for a walk. So this is where we're going to understand how our nervous system perceives these things into fight, flight, freeze, or appease. Some people are going to call that fawning, where we just make ourselves smaller to stay in the situation. And I'm going to encourage you to try. I want you to try different things so that you can build your own resilience to bounce back from any time something happens to you. And then we just continue to self-reflect. We are not going to be perfect, but we're going to offer ourselves grace to get better at navigating conflict and control of our situations. We have so much more agency over control than we give ourselves credit for. So let's keep going. I'm a big behavioral scientist. I want to know what goes on in our brain when this stuff is happening. So there is a fascinating science behind emotional triggers and how our brain responds to them. And this is where we start to look at what goes on with our amygdala, one of the oldest parts of our brain, and then our prefrontal cortex, which is one of the newer parts of our brain. So as we've evolved, brain has changed. And this is where we're going to look at using our older part and our newer part and what happens. So first of all, when we go into fight, flight, freeze, this is because our body, our physical body is triggering the brain and saying the energy that I'm feeling right now is a perceived threat. So if we were back like in tribal days, let's say we're approaching a saber-toothed tiger, okay, we might feel this. And what's going to happen is our amygdala is going to signal, and it is going to activate us into our fight, flight, freeze, appease mode, where we're going to go into that fight or flight, and we are going to have a cortisol release because our body is now like, hey, this is not good. So what happens when we're dealing with other people is our body is reading the energy that is being put off by other people. I do a lot of work on the science of human connection, and I talk about you're responsible for the energy you bring in the room. You are either going to leave people better than you found them or you're not. You are either giving and being a fountain that pours out into other people, or you are being a drain that sucks it. Energy either goes out or in. And so when we are receiving energy from another person, our brain is processing that into, okay, is this an okay energy? Do we like this? Do we not? Is this threatening? And we pay attention to body language. We pay attention to tone. We're not necessarily listening to the words that are being said. We are assessing, our brain and the subconscious and the unconscious are assessing all the other elements of this person that we are navigating or working with. And this is what's triggering that. Once we get triggered, our prefrontal cortex, which tends to be tied to rationalization, tries to help us justify our decision making. It's not the true decision making center, but we're not talking about that today. It's going to give you some rational decision making and understand objectives, numbers, facts, figures. It's going to disengage. So this is where we go into the feeling center of our brain. We no longer have what's going on from the objective standpoint. And this is why we tend to lead to impulsive or irrational decisions. If you've ever heard of the term emotional hijacking, this is what happens. It's where we start to overwhelm our thinking brain and our feeling brain, and they freeze because it can't have, it's trying to save you. And again, we're in a perceived threat state. So our brain's kind of like, eh, and our processing of rational thought, figures, information shuts off. And so we have to find a way to reboot it. During this, we've got those flooded cortisol and adrenaline. And this is because the amygdala signals this and it starts to be pushed out through your body. And again, great when you're trying to run from a saber-toothed tiger. My dog likes to chase squirrels, and I always think about this. I'm like, oh, whew, that was a big shoot of cortisol and adrenaline as that squirrel scurries up the tree, or you see a bunny rabbit and then they jet across the lawn, and then the interesting piece about animals versus humans, animals do a good job of then shutting this off and they can restore themselves quickly. We tend to hold on to this stress. And unless you're completing the stress cycle on a regular basis, this can lead to some other physiological issues, but just some stuff to be aware of. So the amygdala, which we're going to refer to as our guard dog, it is here to keep us responding to threats and understand our emotions like fear or anger. Then we have that prefrontal cortex, which we will call our wise owl. And this helps us rationalize our situations and help us make thoughtful decisions backed by facts and figures. So when we understand how these two come into play, we can understand better about what is physiologically going on in our bodies. So we're like, I just don't feel good about this, or I feel threatened, or you can start to feel your energy kind of like make your skin stand up, or you feel like pins and needles. So we've got that amygdala activation. Our prefrontal cortex ends up shutting off and going offline, and that can have us lash out. It can have us shut down. We've got different ways of addressing things depending on our upbringing and what we have seen work well or not well for us throughout time. A lot of times this is conditioned in us from a very small age. If you've ever read Oprah's What Happened to You book, this can help trigger, it helps us understand what's going on from an emotional rationalization standpoint on how we respond to things. So fight, flight, freeze is not something that you can choose in the moment. Your body's going to be responding to it based upon your environmental circumstances and the training and the influence that people have had around you growing up. So then when we see this emotional hijacking, this is where we've got that like disconnect between emotion and reason. We can understand that there is logic and figures and facts and numbers to get us from point A to point B and still have us feeling, I don't like that feeling. I don't like that. Like it just doesn't feel right. And this is where our feelings can kind of contradict where our logic and rationalization is. Since we're in work comp, I'm going to give you a work comp example. So our brain has to get from point A to point B. We like to have our narrative illustrated through objective facts and figures to get us from point A to point B. And if we're good at communicating, we can get there pretty easily. So, okay, Somebody's off work, they get a doctor's note, we talk to the supervisor reaches out, gives us a, yep, let's go ahead and get this person back to work. Person comes back to work, feels seen and acknowledged and validated by their work experience. Doop. Super easy, right? Okay. Let's say it goes a little differently. Human is injured. Human gets patient status report. Human hears nothing. So human hears nothing, might reach out to the adjuster, not get a call back, doesn't hear anything from their boss. There's no communication going on. Human still has to get to point B and make this rationalization in their head about what's going on. So what can happen is if we aren't filling it with objective facts or having communication, injured worker, injured human over here is going to start to think things like, my boss doesn't care about me. My employer is not non-responsive. The adjuster thinks I'm just a number. Nobody really cares about me. And when we start to look at that, the brain's going to draw its own conclusion either way. How are you filling it with objective facts and figures to get people to look at things differently so that we don't go into a rationalization where the feeling brain overpowers the thinking brain? And when we start to look at this, we've got this fight, flight, freeze, appease, or fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or if you want to just look at fight, flight, freeze, this is where we start to look at what is going to happen as a result. So sometimes during this process, when we get emotionally hijacked, you might have an injured worker who lashes out and they go into fight response because now they're mad and now they're upset that no one is reaching out to them and they might become the protagonist in their own agency and go get an attorney. Flight might do nothing and just freeze. And they will go into fear, dread, become the victim, and just kind of let life happen to them. Then we've got flight, which maybe they run away. Some of these will end up with attorneys at multiple points. So things to think about. And then appeasing might be very passive aggressive. And so we see that, which it's so fascinating when we start to get into the science of passive aggressive people, but we will get away from that. What you can do if this is you, and I know I just went down an injured worker route, but when we think about when it's us, let's say we were in that meeting again, we've been called emotional, what do we do? Some of these ways that you want to do is you've got to calm down your central nervous system and your parasympathetic nervous system. We need to figure out a way to just get it calmed down. Because again, some of these things that are going to trigger you, you don't have a cognitive ability to be like, I don't want that to trigger me. It's going to happen because it's in a different part of your brain than your cognitive functioning. So know that that's okay. Know that that exists. But when you feel something and you're like, oh, I don't love that, what can you do to start regulating that? We're going to start by doing some deep breathing exercises. You're just going to focus on breathing in through your nose, out through your mouth. Now, again, I'm going to tell you, I like to physiologically shape shift how I'm in a physical meeting, but also you might not be able to do that, maybe depending on the situation. Other ways to do this are to take those slow, deep breaths. All right, so I told you I like to switch my legs. You can also ground your feet firmly and focus on your senses. I can feel my feet pressing into the ground. I'm going to push myself to the edge of my chair, roll my shoulders back and down, and really feel my presence. And then maybe pay attention to what's going on. What can you smell? What can you hear? What do you see? Maybe if you have water, can you taste the water? What are you hearing? And being very mindful. And then paying attention to what is going on in your thoughts. And can you control these in any capacity? We're trying to just rewire that brain in that moment to get you out of this hyperflexed point. So we want to think about some other tools that can happen. So we've talked about breathing. Now we've talked about planting your feet down firmly in the ground, keeping your body upright. But I want you to figure out what's going to work for you, because this is a resilience type thing where if this is conflict is happening to us and we are involved in conflict, we want to figure out how quickly we can refuel ourselves, because resilience isn't about enduring the long haul. It is about how quickly you can continue to refresh and refuel yourself and get back in the game. So our number one goal is to regain our composure. And that's going to look different for different people. I have had amazing bosses, and I'm going to give you guys some more personal examples where I just need to unload. Like I know I go into fight mode when I am on Threatville, and I come to fight, come to play. Here we go. And so I have had bosses that will be like, shut the door. They let me go, and then the energy is done, and I can move on. Not everyone is going to be able to receive that, and not everyone is going to be able to do that. So we've got to figure out what is that for you. The higher up you get in hierarchy in organizations, the less likely you're going to be able to just word vomit onto someone. Having a journal and journaling out a paragraph, just a paragraph about what is frustrating you, get it out and get it out on that paper. Just do a paragraph. You don't need to write a book. We're just trying to get it out of your body, like physically getting it out of your body. And there's a lot of science behind using your brain or letting your pen just flow and get it out. So that could be something to help. If you are going to do that and you are going to write anything about any coworker or your company or whatnot, please destroy it. Just don't want anyone getting in trouble, but this is a great exercise to just get stuff out. But what you want to do is try and figure out what's going to work for you. Sometimes getting up and going for a walk is going to be your ultimate. Maybe you have a person you can go with. Maybe you can just go get yourself a hot tea. What is that going to look like for you that's going to help you get away for a moment, take a couple deep breaths, and reset yourself? Because remember, this is our resilience. We are trying to reset during conflict and after conflict. If you can get outside, even more bonus to get a little bit of sunlight. And we're talking about like 5 minutes. I'm not asking you to go take a half-hour break. We're talking about like quick strategies where maybe you just go walk up and down the stairs twice, come back, reset yourself, and like move on. So this is where we start to look at what other soothing techniques exist. So we see a lot of fidget ideas. If you have like fidget spinners or any of those little snappy guys, you can start to use these to help kind of break that neural pathway that's starting to form during that conflict piece. And it can help you just like break out that part so that you aren't feeling the emotions that are tied to what is transpiring. So we've talked about deep breathing, calm that mind, get moving, the physicality. Most of us are actually kinesthetic processors. I used to think I was cool, and I would tell people, I'm just a kinesthetic processor. I need to go walk this out while I make a decision. Well, most of us do better when we've had some movement. Our bodies are designed to move, but just a quick walk or going up and down the stairs can help you re-engage into a very mindful dynamic. Uh, music. Music can be so powerful. So maybe you want to listen to some calming nature songs. Maybe you want to listen to some death metal. I don't know what's going to float your boat. You will figure that out. Now, to process some emotions, you want to pay attention to beats per minute. So if you need the soothing sounds to try and calm, we're looking for less than 40 beats per minute in a song. Otherwise, if you're going to go more into the nature grounding songs, those are also great. Just hearing some of those meditation music behind the scenes can be really helpful. If you want to just get it out from an energetic perspective, we're going to amp you up and we're going to go to 160 beats per minute plus. And that's going to help you. It depends, again, how you are from a fight, flight, freeze type mentality about what's going to be the best way for you to process this out. And just try something. Try something to see, is this going to work? Is this not? It's going to be whatever is best for you. One of the other things you can do is to focus on something objective. So if you can't get up and go for a walk, you're trying the breathing, we've planted our feet, we've moved ourselves, and we're not getting anywhere. We're going to make your brain focus on something numbers oriented and very fixed. So this is where you'd start to look around the room and be like, okay, I'm going to pick up 5 things that are red. And it's going to start to re-engage your frontal cortex into looking for 5 red object. Look, are you red? Are you not? And it's going to kind of reboot that frontal cortex. So it's going to interrupt the panic response that's going on from your amygdala because you're choosing to focus on something different. We've got a numerical count. We're trying to codify it, and we're trying to get our brain to go back into these objective, rational thoughts of, okay, 5 red things. Where are those things throughout the room? Okay, got it. And this should be a nice way to reset your brain. So this is where we also want to think about how we are engaging with other people. And so while we are understanding how we can regulate ourselves in conflict, let's talk about the people that we're working with while we're having a conflict. So understanding where people are, there is this past tense, future tense, and present tense. So when we are in past tense, this tends to be we are in victim mode. So if we are talking in past tense during a situation where we have a specific issue at hand and people are speaking in past tense, they're in reaction mode. And they are going to be thinking of things in the lens of I'm a victim of circumstance. Okay, I want you to think about how you show up in this as well, because my goal is for you to be a protagonist of your own story. But sometimes we end up in these different lenses depending on what's going on. So, past tense, victim, reaction mode. When we get to future tense, we're more in that rescuer state, okay? And we're telling people what's going on. Present state ends up being more of this like persecutor, and we're going to be putting down the situation that's at hand. And again, we're being specific to the situation and not specific to the people involved. When we are in a conflict, we want to focus specifically on what the issue is that we're having a conflict over. This is not about the people. This is not about their characteristics or their values. We are paying attention to what the issue is. And if you can get people to focus more on the issue, this makes it a little bit easier to work through conflict. So our goal is that we're trying to get our teams, when we're working through a conflict with them, is transforming them from this kind of victimy, dreaded drama, and we're going to call it the drama triangle here in a second, where we're going from dramatic to empowered. And I think about this a lot from the injured worker landscape and the workers' compensation system. However, I want you to think about how you can navigate it specifically for you. Our goal is to get somebody out of victim mode into creator mode. Like, okay, you've been injured. We're going to make sure that you can get to being the empowered protagonist of your own story. So we're going to stop reacting to situations, and we're going to find ways that we can use choice, the power of choice, and give you more agency and control in your own wheelhouse. Then we want to look at going from rescuer to coach. So this is where we stop trying to be that rescuer of things, but we're going to move from telling people to asking. And this is kind of like telling somebody you're fine versus asking somebody for help. We all do this quite a bit. We stay in the victim mode of future tense in this way that we can tell people, no, I'm fine, I'm doing great, I can do all these things, I'm wonderful, when really we should be asking for help and feeling empowered to deploy resources around ourselves. This one's tricky and is one that I'm continuing to work on, because I like to do that. I'm fine, then go take it on all myself, and then I'm angry later. So then I throw myself into my victim mode, even though I'm the one that chose to do this. So things to think about how we show up. Then we want to look about from being the persecutor to the challenger. We want to stop putting down things and figure out how to build them up. This isn't going to work because of blah, 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 blah. Well, it could work if we learned from this prior experience and try this instead. Think about how these relate in your own organizations and what they look like as a result. So I want to go through two triangles here. We've got the drama one where we're in victim mode. And then we have the empowered triangle where we are the protagonists of our own story. And this is where we look at the energy that you're giving off to your people, and the energy that they are bringing to you is either going to be more of a fountain and you're an illuminator where we're on this empowered road, or we're a drain and we're an energy vampire and we are sucking the energy back. So again, how are you leaving people? You're either leaving them better than you found them or you're not. Your energy is either positive or it is not. So when we start to look at this dynamic, when we start to look at this from an interpersonal conflicts, this is how we understand where those go wrong and the dysfunctional relationship patterns that exist within. So the drama triangle we just talked about: victim, persecutor, and rescuer. And these roles end up being very unhealthy at specific times, and we bounce between these at different points depending on what is going on through the day. But our goal is to break free from these counterproductive cycles, and also to figure out our way to, when we are in a situation like this, how do we empower our teams again? And this is where we start to try and make more conscious choices. It just takes one choice in the right direction to start moving forward and get us out of this rut. Just make one good decision, step forward, and then see what else is there. And then we make another consecutive decision and we see what information is there. And we just start shifting into a more empowered mindset, and it just starts with one decision at a time. So when we start looking at these, we talked a little bit about these roles, more so from a how do you know, from an auditory standpoint. Again, I was saying the tense of words is a really good way for you to be aware of where your team is sitting or somebody that is in a conflict with you. We've got to listen to the tense of words. Again, this is where like body language is important. The vocalics are important. Tense of words are important, because that is going to give you an indication of where people sit at that point in time. Victims, all right? This is like the world's happening to me. I'm powerless, helpless, and I cannot take responsibility for my situation. We all know people who go into this mode. Something gets tough and they are the ultimate, here's the drama, here's the suck. A lot of times these people have low emotional intelligence, and this isn't meant to be derogatory in any construct, but if you think about the elements that make up emotional intelligence, self-awareness, self-regulation, social skills, empathy, and motivation, victim mentality isn't going to be strong in those. So if people have a low emotional intelligence, this might be an easy area for them to fall into because they lack the ability to understand those other 5 components that can help them self-regulate to get themselves out of that triangular role. So something to be aware of. They believe they have no agency of control over their own life. So this is, I'm a victim of circumstance. Then we start to look at the persecutor. This is where we blame, judge, and criticize others. This is very divisive, and they see themselves as morally superior. Us versus them, big time. This is, you can sometimes sense anger or frustration or force when we're dealing with this. And then we've got the rescuer. So this is more that future tense. And they feel that they need to save the victim. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to get here. They feel needed in this process, but they might be an enabler. This is different than empowered. So this is in the drama triangle, not in the empowered spectrum, but the tenses still work out pretty well for both of these. So when we start to look at what are these emotional triggers, the victims is about power and losing control of their power. Sometimes we see this with our injured workers in the work comp system where they just feel like they have no agency of control because the system is happening to them. And this is where if we can try and give them any type of sense of control, sense of choice, sense of agency, it helps them gain power back. And instead of them blaming us for what's happened to them, we can then provide them some choice and some options. Like, I'm so sorry this has happened to you. Here's what we're going to do to help set you up for success. We're going to get you out of this drama triangle. We're not going to be a victim here. You're going to be the protagonist of your own story, and we're going to move you into an empowerment type role. Persecutor ends up being angry, critical, controlling behavior because they want to avoid their own emotions. Passive aggressive people, when they are passive aggressive to you, it's something coming from within themselves. They are literally portraying it on to you and pushing it out to you. And then we've got the rescuer that's going to save people from their problems without making them take responsibility. Oof. All right, so let's think about this. When have you found yourself in any of these roles? Because guess what? We all bounce between them. It just depends what it is. Sometimes it's more familial. Sometimes we fall into the roles, maybe with our parents, even though we are adults. We all have situations where we kind of fluctuate between these positions. And when we start to realize we kind of fluctuate in all of them, it just depends what it is. Think about what you complain about. Whatever it is that you complain about in life, that's a really good indicator of what this is for you. How do those patterns then showcase in your life, and what do you do to start to break yourself out? Things to think about. And yes, you will get a copy of all of these slides. So identifying the dramatic drama triangle. This is crucial to shift these conflicts and get us back into a situation where we empower and we help people, we uplift to get people to understand their agency of control. So we've got to figure out what are those triggers. Also, is this happening on your team with the same people over and over again? Is it a one-time thing? Like, we look for patterns when we start to look at this recognition, and then paying attention. The better we get to know our teams, kind of like the better we get to know ourselves, we can then figure out how to help identify people, identify the characteristics that are starting to show, and then offer nice cues, different types of feedback to help them move back forward into, again, this is like us bouncing into resilience. How do we shapeshift out of this? And we start to, hey, I'm aware, here's what's happening. Hey, you're going down that road. And we are able to then find cues to help people use more self-reflection and get themselves out of these type of situations. So, talked about this. The victim is they end up having fear and powerlessness, and they don't feel like they can change the situation. So I think we've hit that one. Over-involvement, codependent behaviors come from that rescuer, and from the persecutor, they just are justified in their criticisms and demands. So this is where we want to start paying attention to the warning signs. And this is not just for ourselves, but again, how do we start to see this in our teams? We want to hear the complaining piece. Pause and reflect what's going on. Okay, we're complaining about what? Is that within your control? Is it not? Because ideally, the best thing that we could do is focus on everything that we can control and let the world happen the way it's going to. We also need to become aware of how often we complain because we can rewire our neural pathways with this, and it helps us break free from unhealthy patterns. So, sharing personal experiences and stories helps people get this. So, if you are going to do this with your team and you're going to start paying attention, get people to share personal experiences and stories, because a lot of times people won't understand what's going on if we're having this conversation in a group dynamic. But if you can see, like using a familial example, I mean, we all have these familial examples. And this is where we start to see how this applies in real time. So I would encourage you to make sure that your teams can reflect on times that they've struggled, because you're going to take this back into your organization. Their stories are going to provide really insightful information as to how we should handle things, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and then can inspire other people to take action as a result. And when we share this, or you're working in one-on-ones, doing this in a smaller group to a bigger group, this can be really helpful in managing constructive conflict. So we can be vulnerable, and it's okay to be vulnerable. I like to use family dynamics because everybody's got that crazy uncle they don't want to sit by at Thanksgiving, or everyone's had a tiff with their mom. There's just so many things that are normal. So if we use these, you get to start building some more empathy and trust within your group dynamics. And these help with what strategies have people used before. Let's hear from people that have had these in these interactions and what's worked, what hasn't worked. Again, like if you want to press, if you get called emotional in a meeting, how are you handling this? And the more that we can share and we can share our stories, the better that we get into, all right, this happened to me. What do I do next? Has anyone else had this happen? Like, all right, I had an injured worker get really frustrated with me and they said these things to me. Okay, we've talked about compassion fatigue. All right, so what do you do in those times? How do we stop again? And we look at resilience from a rest and recharge versus a continue to endure. So, things to think about when you are sharing personal stories with your team dynamics and sharing these back in your organizations. So we want to shift people from this dramatic triangle and get into this empowerment phase. So I want to think of this as like blooming. So this is where we get more intentional, solution focused. So you've got the creator that's going to take responsibility for their choices and actions, and we are now into solution mode. The challenger is going to give more constructive feedback and encourage the growth, pushing the creator to improve. And we need these in different areas. So maybe your creators are your team members right now. Maybe you need to be the challenger, or maybe you end up bouncing into the coach. And it depends. Again, we are all in different situations, whether it be from a power dynamic standpoint, maybe it's a specific project, or it's a specific situation. So when we start to shift these goals as we're trying to help people navigate from going into this victim blame mentality into this creator, we want to stop being passive victims to empowered creators and take ownership of the situation. Find ways that you have agency and control over the decisions that you make. When we think about this from an injured worker lens, I like to focus on this as, okay, here's what you're going to be paid under workers' compensation, but I can offer you a choice. Do you want this in a debit card? Do you want this in an ACH deposit? Or do you still want an old school paper check if that's an option? Because you're still giving people a sense of choice and ownership and agency of control, even though they don't really get a choice. If you want a family example, you can have carrots or peas. Either way, you're having vegetables, but I'm going to give you a choice along the way. We can find ways to do this with our teams, and we can find this as ways to do it with ourselves. When we move from persecutor to challenger, this is where we are looking at everything as an opportunity to grow. So even if we fail, we're going to learn something along the way. But what if we just tried? And then when we look at rescuer to coach, we are going to put the empowerment back. Where are the roles? Where are the responsibilities? Where's the accountability? And what action do we expect people to take? And then it's not on you all the time. But where do we put that roles of responsibility and accountability and follow through? So we're going to focus on solutions. We're going to figure out how to empower ourselves, and we're going to focus more on a collaboration front versus a conflict. We are working together. Again, we are specific at an issue. We are trying to solve an issue when we are working on conflict, and this is how we look to move forward. Something else I want you to think about, if you ever wear a hair tie or a bracelet, I want you to think about any time that you start to complain, I want you to just touch it. Not snap your wrist, nothing like that. I just want you to touch it. Because what we're going to do when we are using emotional intelligence, we're trying to build that muscle. And in order to do that, we have to heighten our own awareness. So let's start with something basic. Let's figure out every time we complain. When we complain, simply touching a bracelet, just touch and bring yourself into a awareness. This is just going to make you think, okay, I need to stop. And if we just aware, then the next step would be to reframe. And we start to do this and we start to navigate, okay, I've touched the bracelet, I need to reframe this. I touched the bracelet, I need to reframe this. So I want you to think about that if you're going to take this back to your teams. If we're going to work on this, I want to encourage you guys to do something like that, whether it be a bracelet or something else that you can think about that's going to help you navigate this and use this in a way that can be helpful to cultivate awareness and to rewire your brain. So think about that bracelet, think about shifting your perspective, and tapping will help you increase your own self-awareness. So now we figure this out a little bit more. We figure out what our values are, the roles that we play, and how we navigate these in conflicting situations. The better that we are at understanding what lens we are coming at things from, the better we can understand why we feel violated in certain situations. And then we can connect it to the, okay, well, what do I need to do to change this then? Because I don't want to feel like this anymore. Is it having a conversation with somebody about a specific issue? Coming to the table prepared. We want to think about this. So again, we're going to identify those values and then align our actions. So here's the thing. A lot of times we will use a lot of lip service, and this happens a lot if you think about social media. We end up becoming keyboard warriors. So think about it from that lens. Do your values identify with your actions, and then we become very intentional. So again, check your calendar. Where are you spending your time? Check your bank account. Where are you spending your resources? And we start to think about our values as choices and the lens that we bring to the table. And when we start to get more aware, it's going to help us be more intentional with where we're spending our time. We can then regulate what's going on. We understand why this bothers us, how more clear we are. And we're really starting to peel apart this onion. I talk about this quite a bit for the past 2 years in our emotional series and just kind of our self-awareness series, where we're trying to get back to that onion. Who are you at your core? And then understanding that our values are something that's kind of been there for a long time and they're innately in us, and we just refine them over time. And we refine and we refine and we refine. Now, caveat that if there's a traumatic experience, yes, we understand values might change as a result of this. But ideally, what we're looking for is congruence in our life so that we have a path of least resistance for us to just continue to flow, and vibe. We really want to avoid reactions. We want to be proactive, and we can make choices that are in alignment with who we are at our core. The reactivity is where we start to see this conflict, like, or we get in reaction mode versus protagonist mode. And we can't avoid everything, but it's something that we just want to be aware of. And this is where, when we are making decisions, we're using all of these elements to understand how to be intentional with what we are doing and how we're planning to move forward, and asking other people that are involved with us to also be a part of this. So as we conclude this, I just want to kind of go through a couple of takeaways, since I know it is now 12 o'clock, to help you navigate some of these conclusions and challenging situations. So developing emotional intelligence, this helps you build stronger relationships. And when we're starting to navigate conflict, understanding your triggers, your values, and how you empower can absolutely help you elevate yourself in a leadership role, from a self-leadership to leadership within your organizations, as well as the influence you have on other people. So practice some of these techniques: our breathing, grounding, physiologically changing yourself, getting up and going for a walk, getting outside, whatever that is, and the bracelet approach. So keeping yourself, let's build some self-awareness, and then we're going to rewire our brain. This can help you as we move forward with growing and personal development. So remember, this is just the beginning. We want to start with self-awareness first, and then we can move on. If you guys have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and make sure you check out Bloom, where all of our personal development series is.